ever so slowly on making you a little more literate in these issues of the macro economy. Quite a bit of what he mentioned in there we're going to get to in the very last chapter we cover on fiscal policy. But you saw that there was a number of things he touched on that we've mentioned up to this point as well. So, any comments, questions? Like, I saw that one on Friday, and I said, well, we got to get that in there. All right, so we're going to come real close to wrapping up our money chapter today. When is our second test? Friday. I got some good news for you, I think. The test is still going to be Friday. The good news is that I don't think we're going to cover Chapter 9. We're going to stop with Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is a pretty long chapter. Hopefully you've been hitting it. So there'll be less material covered on there. So I'll make adjustments to the MyEcon Lab for your homework problems. So this is going to be it. So what we're covering, and we're going to pretty much wrap up, if we don't wrap up, the money chapter today. But it's probably one of the longer chapters of the book. And of course, an important issue in the macro economy. All right, so we were just about to the point to start to model in our supply and demand framework the money market. We put a lot of the pieces to the puzzle together, and I want to kind of bring you back to the forest for a moment of where we're going with this class. So we've got, hopefully, an understanding that the economy is dependent upon resources, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Money is not a resource per se, but it's kind of the oil to the engine. So that's why money plays an important role on facilitating trade and does have an impact on prices. So the previous two chapters outlined the labor and capital market. Those are the things we really care about. So we had labor hours being measured with a labor demand curve and a labor supply curve and a real wage determining some bucket level of labor, right? Some amount of labor being worked. And then we had a loanable funds market that helped us approximate the accumulation of physical capital through the borrowing and lending of funds. So we had the supply of loanable funds, the demand for loanable funds, and we had the real interest rate. We talked about how that market is global. People are willing and able to roam the globe for the best rate of return, given some amount of risk of where they want to place those dollars. And that gives us a certain amount of money being exchanged in the loanable funds market. That money, we learned, gets funneled into the accumulation of capital. So our capital buckets. We got labor and capital, our two primary resources there. And today we're starting off with money. And so in the money market, we're going to measure the quantity of money that's floating around our island. And the price of money is the interest rate. So if you want money, if you literally want to go out and buy money, I know it sounds absurd, but you can, right? You can go to the bank and buy some of this. What I pull out here, I got $32. You can go buy some money, right? You go to the bank and they'll hand you this across the aisle, not from your account either, right? You can take out a loan. So the price of the money is what? What do you have to pay to get money? Interest. All right, so the price variable that we're going to put in the money market here is the interest rate. And this interest rate is going to be the nominal rate of interest, little I from our formula. Remember that in the loanable funds market, we had little r, the real rate of interest. And those two things were connected by the inflation rate. So the real rate of interest is equal to the nominal rate minus the inflation rate. So this one takes into account inflation. This one does not. The way we're going to account for the inflation variable, which we do in all of these, right? We had the real wage, so we did it here. The real interest rate. This time we're going to leave this one alone and factor it in on the quantity side. And so we're going to take the quantity of money that's adjusted for inflation, the real quantity of money. So on this little generic, I'm going to redraw this later, but this is the real quantity of money. And then we're going to think about some supply and demand. So that's where we're going today. I want to start with the supply curve. I think is the easier one to think about. If we are to think about how much money there is today, we can add it up, and whatever it is would be some fixed amount. And that amount is controlled by the Federal Reserve, we learned. The Federal Reserve had 3 tools at its disposal we did last time. What were the 3 tools? This is where it's okay to go flip, flip, flip. Oh yeah, I got to know this for the next test. 3 tools. Discount rate. Required reserve ratio, the amount that they can't loan out. And open market operations, the purchase and sale of those bonds. So it's the Federal Reserve that controls the supply of money. The money supplied on our island is determined by those Board of Governors, the 7 economists that kind of control the supply of money, of which Wayne Angell was one of them. So we're going to draw that as a vertical line, partly to think that, well, they just pick what they want. They can pick it here, they can pick it here, they can pick it here. They can use those 3 tools to determine where the supply of money should be. So it's the first one that we've had that doesn't have this traditional upward slope to it. It's fixed at whatever the Federal Reserve chooses it to be at. The demand for money, on the other hand, comes to us from households and businesses that are choosing to hold money. So note, our agents in this, the supply curve is determined by the Fed, the government. If we go back to our bucket theory material, we've got our 3 agents of households, the government, and businesses. The government is determining the supply of money, and the demand for money is being determined by households and business. Important to remember that money goes beyond greenbacks. What else does it include? Checking accounts. Good. If it's M2, it includes money, checking accounts, and savings accounts, and money market accounts, and some other types of accounts. All of these accounts, though, are fairly liquid. It's not your 401k that's invested into some stock or bond market portfolio, right? It's not a long-term investment. It's very liquid type stuff. Things that might be used for transactions. That's why we monitor M2 as our primary target of money. We want to know, we being, I suppose, some of the policymakers involved here, they want to know how much are people carrying around of this stuff? Because if it's in the wallet, it might tend to be used over at Walmart later today, right? It'll be used for transactions. That money will go into somebody else's wallet, go into somebody else's bank account. It's the stuff that floats around for transactions. Consumption made up 70% of all the economic activity. So all of the spending in the economy comes to us via cigarettes. Consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. All of the spending needs money to help it go. To make that transaction happen, we need money. So we're going to monitor the supply of money that the Fed is doing through policy, as well as think about how much money businesses and households are holding on to at any given point in time. All right, so let's draw this up a little more carefully with a bigger graph. And then we'll define some things. So, vertical money supply curve, nominal interest rate, and the real quantity of money, real, let's call it M2 even, just to kind of remember, it could be other measures of money, but M2 is our primary target. So, the money market explains variations in the nominal interest rate, little I, explains variations in the nominal interest rate and the real quantity of money demanded and supplied. So let's start off with real M2. The real quantity of money is equal to the nominal quantity of money, nominal M2. And then we're just going to pull off our old trick of dividing by the price level. Same trick we used in the labor market when we wanted to find out the real purchasing power of mom's nursing pay from one year to the next. We looked at how the prices of goods and services have gone up or down and deflated the nominal wage. So this was big W divided by the price level. We're doing the same thing we did when we measured real GDP. We took nominal GDP, divided it by the price level. So it's the same old stuff. Nothing new. But it's the real quantity of money being held. Okay, and then just to be official, since this one was a little more official, let's multiply times 100. Remember, that's just because we've got the price level shifted over, and we really want to deflate that by 1.13 or 1.26 to make it become smaller. All right, so money supply. Just to get some of these definitions here. The money supply curve is the real quantity of money in circulation. So we don't include the money that's held in the bank vaults, remember, when we defined M1 and M2. The real quantity of money in circulation that is controlled by the Fed. And then let's just put in parentheses, recall the three tools. those three tools then are going to be used to increase or decrease the money supply. And so if the Fed pursues, what's that? The three tools, we just listed them, but discount rate, required reserve, and open market operations. So we used one of the three tools and we said that it would increase the money supply or decrease. Remember I put those up arrows, down arrows, the very last thing we did. So if there was a open market purchase of bonds, an open market purchase, did that increase or decrease the money supply? Decrease. Open market purchase. So those of you, that's always a little tricky, start thinking back, oh yeah, that's where bonds are floating around in the economy. Got to get my props out here. I'm the Federal Reserve, you guys are the economy. And so the old IOU government bonds floating around. The Federal Reserve does an open market purchase, buys the bond, money supply goes up. Now that we're in the money market, that's going to be a shift to the right of the money supply curve. So if we go from, let's say, MS1 to MS2, now you see the value of the economic model using supply and demand. You can start to make predictions. So instead of just memorizing that it's going to increase the money supply, it starts to tell us the influence it's going to have on interest rates. Interest rates are going to go down, right? So initially we start here where interest rates are at, just to make up a number, let's call it I1 of 3%. And with that open market purchase, interest rates are going to fall to maybe I2 here at 2.2%, whatever they are. So we get downward pressure on the interest rates. So recall the three tools. We've got the discount rate, the required reserve ratio, and open market operations in general. And the example we just did is a purchase. An open market purchase leads to an increase in the money supply. And now that we're using the model, we can further say that that's going to lead to a decrease in interest rates and an increase in the quantity of money as we move from Q1 to Q2. Now, just for a little fun, why is that important? Interest rates, a policy action now, not the free market, a policy action has been put into place to drop the interest rates. Why? Who responds to that? Consumers, and who else? Who else responds to interest rates falling? I'd agree, consumers.
Well, it's like anyone who's supplying loanable funds too.
Okay, anybody who's supplying loanable funds and who's demanding the loanable funds. But who is our primary player in the loanable funds market? Is it businesses or households? Businesses. So lower interest rates stimulates investment, might change some of the behavior over here. That's where we start to link things together of analyzing what the impact of some movements are on interest rates. All right, just wanted to comment on that and foreshadow that for the future. Money demand. Money demand shows the real quantity of money that is demanded at various interest rates. Now let's go ahead and write it all out. At various nominal interest rates. Now I want to tack on a little more specifically some of the ceteris paribus assumptions. What did ceteris paribus mean? Holding all other things constant. So we're not going to allow things to move. Similar here, when we said this is the supply of money, holding constant all their policy tools. As soon as they change one of the policy tools, the thing moves around. So over on the consumer side, we're going to hold constant a given level of real GDP. So given real GDP, remember, real GDP is like our income. And financial innovation. We'll explain that here in a bit. All right, we've already kind of went over the shifters, but I want to keep nice and tight the definition of the curves and then what shifts them. So let's just move right into the shifters that you should have memorized for the next test. Money supply shifters are the three tools. A change in the discount rate, a change in the required reserve ratio, and a change in open market operations. We'll make it nice and crystal clear. I won't spend the time going through that. Look back from last time's notes that this one went up, that went down, you know, the directions of the change. And then money demand shifters once we change the things we held constant here, things are going to move around on us. Number one, a change in real GDP. I always found it helpful when I was learning this material to think about holding money in your wallet. That usually does you pretty good. So think about the quantity of money that you hold in your wallet. So imagine that you guys are graduated and maybe you're 4 years down the road. You didn't take out much of student loans, or you've started making such a good job and you were dedicated towards paying those loans off. You don't have any student loans. You don't have any kind of debt, and you're making 50 grand a year. How does the money you hold in your wallet compare now, being debt-free and making 50 grand a year, compared to the amount of money you're holding in your wallet or purse right now as a college student? Where are you holding more money? When you've got more income or less income? What do you think? Where are you holding more money? When you're making a bunch of money, do you tend to hold a couple C notes in your wallet? A couple Benjamins? Are you likely to do a little bit more spending when you're making some money? Yeah. Do you need money to spend? Yeah. And that's why I'm kind of using loosely how much money you're holding in your wallet. Some of you are like, I don't even carry money, I just carry a plastic card. Well, how much money are you holding in your account for transaction purposes, right? So you're spending a lot more money, and therefore you tend to need to hold on to more money as well. So people tend to ride a little fat with their money holdings when they're making more of it. So those two things are positively related. So an increase in real GDP, which is an increase in income, if we're thinking more at the micro level, when you're making more money, you will tend to hold more money. So an increase in real GDP will lead to an increase in money demand, a shift to the right, an increase in money demand at each interest rate I. So if we come back to our graph we got going here, when interest rates were 3% and I was making, let's say, $20,000 a year, which I know is more, maybe I should have picked $10,000 a year or something, but $20,000 a year on average, if this is what I'm making, I used to want to hold $100 in my wallet. Now that I got a sweet job after taking my shiny new Auto University degree to the market and maybe had to wait a little bit, but now that I'm making some money, I used to want to hold $100. Now I'm going to hold $250 at 3%. Assuming that interest rates were the same, I used to want to hold 100, but now I'm going to hold more. At 2%, well, I used to want to hold this amount. Maybe this was 125. But now I'm going to hold more. Even if interest rates were really high, I used to want to hold this much money, now I want to hold more. At this interest rate, I used to want to hold this much, now I want to hold this much. At this interest rate, I used to want to hold this much, now I want to hold this much. This much, 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 this much. If I start collecting enough data, these lines get infinite, or these points get so close together, they start to resemble a line. And that's because the money demand curve had shifted out quite a ways at that level of income. So it's shifted to the right at each interest rate that I had before. So that's what's going on here. A change in income leads to an increase in the interest rate. And if at the same time the Federal Reserve was increasing money supply, if the demand for money increased by this much, the net effect of both things was an increase in the interest rate, right? That's where it would go. Before we didn't have these two competing things going on. All right, questions on that one? So, the more money you make, the more you hold. Let's put this one back to kind of layman's terms here. This is a little too formal for me. The more money you make, the more you carry in your wallet. Was at least the little image that you can hold in your head as you're trying to memorize all these shifters for the next test. All right, so over the last 40 years, talk to me about what you might speculate as a financial innovation as it relates to you as a consumer and as a human being that lives in the United States. What are some things that have evolved that are kind of new over the last 40 years that affect you? What is different now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Just in general, just give me some changes that have happened over the time that might be considered to be financial innovation.
Technology.
Yeah, different types of technology. What?
Like online shopping.
Online shopping, huge, right? Even that one's probably the last 10 years. So what do you use with online shopping?
Like your debit card.
Debit card, PayPal, all those sorts of things. That didn't exist. Well, 10 plus. PayPal's been around for a little while longer, but anyway, fairly recently, that's new. Okay? Anything else you can come? Maybe go date back a little bit further, 20, 30 years beyond when before you guys were born. That little machine that's in the Union as you walk in through the front door to head to lunch. That ATM didn't exist not too long ago, right? Kick out some bills for you. How did that ATM machine, we can come back to the internet thing, but let's think about that ATM machine. Does that cause you to need to hold more money in your wallet or less? Less, right? Back in the old days, here's how it would shake down. And I had ATMs in high school is when they started, catching on. But prior to that, certainly my parents, when they got their paycheck, they went to the bank and made a deposit. And you guys know how it's a little bit of a hassle. Get in your car, go there, depending on how far you live from the bank. It's a bit of a chore to get to the bank. And so you don't want to be going back and forth each time you do it. And so you would tend to hold a lot more cash. You would take a withdrawal to kind of hold on to enough cash that would make you through to the next paycheck. So you might be pulling out a couple $100, $300, whatever it is, that would even be just the normal amount of stuff that you need to buy. Not every place took a card, or even did cards really exist at the cash register at the point of sale. That came along later, right? So all of those sorts of things, online purchases. I just saw something, they were interviewing Jack Dorsey, who was the inventor of Twitter, and he's got something called Square now. Has anybody heard of that?
Yeah.
What is it with Square? Jocelyn, do you hear you?
Maybe this big and it goes on your cellular device and it causes you to do any kind of like a debit or credit transaction right there from your phone.
Right there from your phone. And I saw this little thing that to me this is a little scary, but I guess if you know where you're going, and I think they have some checks and balances, but they showed Jack Dorsey and the person who's doing the interview walk up to the counter at the coffee shop, and he was a regular at the coffee shop. At the point of sale, at the register, a little picture of him came up so that the person who was watching the cash register could match Jack's picture there with who was standing in front of them. And as long as they matched, they could say okay, and a receipt was given to them. And so he would just slide the coffee. There would be no exchange of dollars at all. It was just like, oh, welcome, Jack. Here's your thing. Seamless, done. No actual changing of hands of money. So that sort of stuff has continued to evolve and will continue to evolve over time. All right, so that can have an influence on the demand for money. And what we've seen typically over time has been a decrease in demand. So number 2 on the demand shifter list here, money demand shifters. Oops, sorry. You guys don't need money demand shifters here. Financial innovation. So ATMs, online banking, the acceptance of debit cards everywhere, all that stuff. We could do a long laundry list here. But all of this stuff, an increase in innovation, financial innovation, new ideas, have tended to decrease the demand for money, the need to hold your money in the form of that type of wealth. When you can now take your stock market portfolio, press a button, and through E-Trade you can transfer money from your stocks. You can liquidate your investments in Ford, GM, and Chrysler and put them into your account in fairly short fashion. Now you don't feel compelled to have to hold your wealth in this form that doesn't earn a very good interest rate. So that'll tend to decrease the demand for money. All right, one other thing, just kind of a historical note that I like to throw in. This is why the Fed started using M2 instead of M1 as its primary measure of money. Once it got real easy with ATM machines to transfer money from your savings account to your checking and from money market account to, once you could slosh money around, it's like people didn't hold it in a checking account necessarily as much as they used to. So this measure didn't really become as relevant when you're trying to track the transactions demand. Okay, any other questions or comments here? All right. So, money has some interesting impacts on GDP in the long run. One of my favorite economists, Milton Friedman, back in the late 1960s, was noodling the effects of money. So noodling is the sophisticated term for thinking about money. So Milton Friedman in the late 60s he thought about nominal GDP a bit differently. So, from the 1930s, the stuff that John Maynard Keynes kind of brought forth was a lot of focus on spending. That's part of why we have the expenditure approach, and we think about, well, maybe the government should build some bridges to help out the economy rather than doing some other things. So remember that nominal GDP was equal to C plus I plus G plus X, our cigarettes, thinking about it in the expenditure approach. But really, another way to think about it that we've shown is to just say, well, it's just the value of haircuts times the price of haircuts, the price of lawyer services times the quantity of lawyer services. All the stuff that we've talked about for the end goods in the economy, we're just summing up the dollar value of all spending. So we can think about it more generically, looking at that little equation with the summation sign. So either way you think about it, that was kind of the traditional line of thinking. So Milton said, you know, if you think about all the spending that's going to go on, there's got to be some money that was used to buy it. We kind of highlighted that last time. So it's kind of like, well, there's a certain quantity of money. And then that money, as we learned, remember when we passed it from Shelby, and then it went to, where'd it go from that? Cabela's for Blake's guns, and then it went to for Sal's car, right? That money kind of gets spent multiple times. So we can think about the quantity of money being spent a number of times to handle the transactions that are going on in the economy. So now to put this back into P's and Q's, kind of like this, we learned that nominal GDP could also be looked at as the price level times real GDP. So this is real GDP, the quantity, equals the quantity of money times the velocity of money. All right, so let's define this stuff. So we got the price level, the average level of prices, which we've learned how to calculate back from chapter 4 and 5. We've got real GDP, which is the thing we really care about. Real GDP, which is the quantity of those goods and services that goes ups and downs, and that's what created the expansion and recessions and all of that stuff over time. And then on the right-hand side of the equation, we simply just have the quantity of money. Maybe it's M2, for instance, one of our measures of money. And then the last component is velocity. And velocity is the average number of times a dollar is spent. the average number of times a dollar is spent. Don't forget we're talking about flow variables, right? GDP over the last quarter, over the last year. So this is a flow variable here. So we're talking real GDP for 2013 equals the quantity of money that was in existence in 2013 times the average number of times it was spent in 2013. All of that should math out, thinking about it that way. All right, so he started thinking a little bit more about it. Remember this picture? What's our up and down thing going? What do we call this? The business cycle. And if we think about what the economy is doing over a longer period of time, we can come up with what we think our trend is, right? So the current level of GDP is sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but we always seem to be coming back to something that's fairly consistent, right? Fairly consistent. So over here, what Milton Friedman said was that in the long run, if we look at a long enough period of time, real GDP is going to be what it's going to be. So I'm going to put a bar above it. That's kind of the math notation to say that that's kind of fixed in the long run. The quantity of money is the quantity of stuff is going to be what it's going to be over the time frame. And in the long run, is there any reason that the number of times a dollar gets spent would fluctuate? He thought not. He thought velocity would be pretty much fixed. So then we've got the M and the P left to fluctuate. We've got the M and the P. The M is the quantity of money. Who controls that? The Fed. And so if the Fed increases the money supply by 3%, what is the long-term impact of that on the economy? 3% of this one, which, what do we call that? Inflation. That's the connection he brought. He said, you know what? In the grand scheme of things, the Fed and its policies are just going to lead to increases in this variable. So that was his prediction, is that the percentage change in the money supply was going to be equal to the percentage change in the price level in the long run. That was his prediction in a paper that he presented in the late 1960s. And people thought he was whack. They're like, what? That's not going to happen. That's just some ivory tower academic, thinking that we're going to have inflation problems. And it turned out in the 1970s what happened. I know you guys don't know your history too well, but we had the serious inflation, the most serious inflation we've seen in the United States. All of a sudden, he was the guru of macroeconomics from that prediction. He went from being whack to being the king of monetary theory. We'll pick up there next time.